I'm Jerry, and this is going to be a really quick lesson on how to solder silver in silversmithing. Step one, you got to know how to solder if you're going to make silver jewelry. Now first, let's talk about the silver. This is a piece of silver I bought at the store. This is like 20 gauge or 22 gauge, I think. The smaller the number, the thicker the silver. They actually have a tool that measures the gauge, and you figure out which one it is, and it is practically useless. I've had that tool for 40 years, and I think I've only used it if I'm copying somebody else's jewelry and I want to see what size wire they use for certain things. Okay, anyway, this is sterling silver. Now, 925 sterling, they are not interchangeable. Let's start there. 925 means it's 92.5% silver and it's 7.5% something else. Sterling silver is 925% silver, and that 7.5% is a composition designed by Tiffany's back in the 1800s. That it has other metals in it. Like don't fact check me on this, but it has other metals in it. It has like zinc, I believe, and copper, and maybe a little nickel or something. I don't know, but the thing is that sterling silver, American sterling silver, as it tarnishes, the tarnish is a lighter color. It's more of a white color. It takes longer to tarnish. 925, the other 7.5, if you're getting it from Bali or from Mexico, that 7.5 can be pure copper. That tarnishes very black, tarnishes quickly, leaves rings on your wrist. If you wear it as a bracelet or on your finger, it'll turn them black. It's still 925. It's still the same amount of silver as sterling silver, but American sterling silver was actually patented by the Tiffany company back in the 1800s, and they've allowed the patent to go away, or time made it go away, and people are now, American silver companies are duplicating the Tiffany sterling silver. So, like I said, you got 7.5% other stuff in there. And when you go to heat up the solder, what happens is the first thing that happens is the copper comes to the surface and kind of coats the surface with this black patina. If you've ever tried to solder or heat up a piece of silver, you see it turns black right away. Here's a little piece I was soldering on earlier, and you can see that little black patina on there. That is copper oxides that build up on the surface. And those copper oxides, you cannot stick solder to those oxides. It just won't stick. It'll sit there and you heat it and heat it and heat it, and it balls up and it just sits on top. The solder gets an oxide coating on it. The silver has an oxide coating on it, and the two of them together will never bind. So that's where flux comes in. Flux, which is basically, in a pinch you can use pure borax. But people mix it with different things, a little boric acid, a little this, a little that, and you end up with this stuff called flux, and it comes in a bunch of different ways. Here's one called ultra flux, and that one here is in a jar. It's kind of a thick white liquid. Then there's this one up here I got called aqua flux. I've tried bunches of different fluxes, and this one's aqua flux, and it's clear. They all work. Every one of them works. Every one of them works differently. Some are self-pickling, and we'll talk about pickling later. Some aren't. I personally like the thicker ultraflux because over the 40 years I've been doing this, I've learned exactly how it reacts. When I heat it up, it does the same thing every time. First the water cooks off, it turns white, then it turns dark, and then it turns clear, and then the solder melts. I know that progression. And I've learned over time to count on that more than anything else on when the solder is going to melt. But there's other fluxes, and I don't work for Ultraflux. I don't care which one you buy. But anyway, so what happens with flux is, and I'm making up these numbers, okay? Don't please don't go into a dictionary and then come back and say, oh, the temperature was actually blah blah blah. Okay, here's what happens with flux. At a certain temperature, a low temperature, maybe around 400 degrees, it melts, and it stays a liquid to really high degrees, over thousands of degrees, a couple thousand degrees. And so what happens is, as the oxide comes to the surface of the silver, it floats off into this flux, and it leaves a clean silver surface for the solder to adhere to. Without flux, you can't solder. Solder will only go where there's flux. It is absolutely imperative to use flux when you solder. So anyway, that's a little bit of the science of why you need to have flux on there. Okay, a couple important things I forgot to tell you all about. Solder. Now solder comes in a bunch of ways. You can buy solder already mixed with flux, and it comes in a little tube like this. This is by Euro Tools, and it'll tell you stainless, sterling silver, and it gives you a number. That's the percentage of silver in it. And then you can buy wire. I like wire myself. This is what I use for most things. Solder wire. And solder comes in 3 different forms. There's hard, medium, and soft solder. Something else about silver I skipped over earlier. The reason they add they don't use pure 999 silver to make jewelry is because, number one, it's very soft. That's the big thing. But another strange thing about silver, as you add copper to it, and these are pretend numbers like I said before, let's say silver melts at 1,000 degrees, and let's say copper melts at 1,100 degrees. When you mix them together, for some reason, the more copper you add to the silver, the lower the boiling point goes. I really don't understand the physics of this, but I know that 70%, well, if you get like 97%, they call it hard solder, when it's almost all silver, just a little bit of copper. And that melts at just a little bit below the temperature that the silver is going to melt at. And then there's medium solder, and that's what I use. Medium solder melts, you know, maybe 100 degrees lower than hard solder. Gives me a little bit more time while I'm working to pull the torch away so I don't burn up my project. Medium solder is a good strong solder. Then there's light, what they call soft solder. And soft solder is basically only used for repairs. I've heard some people use it in wire wrapping to secure wire wrapping and stuff, but I don't do that, so I wouldn't know. But soft solder is softer, it's darker, it tarnishes quicker, it has a lot more copper in it. But if you're doing a repair and you don't know what kind of solder the previous artist used, you basically have to use soft solder. And sometimes I use soft solder on the jump ring. You know, after I've already made the necklace and it's all soldered together and I need to put that little ring on the top, I don't want to heat up my whole piece again and possibly have something move, so I might use soft solder on the jump ring. But that's really the only time I use soft solder. Let's talk another quick second about the silver. I know I'm bouncing around here, but there's a lot of information. How do you buy silver? When you go to a store to buy sterling silver, it comes in 24-inch long sheets that are 6 inches wide. So what you do is you go in and you say, I'd like 1.5 inches or 2 inches of, like I said, I think this is 22 gauge. It's a little sturdy. This is I use for backing plate. You might as well get a little heavier silver too if you're making jewelry, because a good deal of the value of silver jewelry is perceived by the person who's buying it. It's not actually in the cost of the silver. Silver at this point is like $20 an ounce in sheet. So when somebody picks up a piece and they feel the heft of it and they know that's silver, that makes them think it's worth a lot more. You know, so don't go through all the work of making something and using super light silver just because you can. Because when you're all said and done, you're going to be unhappy with the result because it has no heft and it has no perceived value by others. So anyway, back to this. All right. So as you're getting your stuff ready to burn or to weld or solder, you need something to do it on. I got a fire brick here, and I use that as my base. And then I use one of these things. They're made out of ceramic. They make a nice flat surface, make it easy, and they take heat pretty well. On one side they got little dimples too, which kind of help in some situations for soldering. You'll figure that out once you start trying to solder odd shaped pieces together. And what I do is I also have a big stack of, somewhere in here, broken pieces. And I use those. Sometimes I have to, you know, jig something to, like, I'll put 2 of them together so that I can hold a ring up on edge so I can solder something on the top. You know, it's not magic. Then you're going to need a solder pick. Now this solder pick is a niobium solder pick. I heard they also make them out of titanium. And the great thing about this is solder won't stick to the pick itself. So if you're moving stuff around in the solder, you don't have to worry about the solder sticking onto your pick. A couple other things people like to have when they're messing is a carbon rod. This is good for moving things around, but this the pick does just as fine. There's different types of tweezers, you know, that hold things together, but you know, all that comes later. As you develop the hobby, you'll realize what you need. Okay. So